Of NAMI at Home Live of 2023. I, for one, am super excited to be the first one in 2023 to ask you to sign up for NAMI Tennessee's email list. It's super easy. Just go to namitn.org and sign up. It's absolutely free. It tells you about stuff like this, the walk, the gala, and it gives great legislative advocacy tips of things that you can do at home to help people living with mental illness and their family members, people like you and me. So check that out over at namitn.org. All right, I'm super excited to bring our guest on. Janet, welcome to the show.
Well, welcome. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I am super, super, super glad you're here. All right, let's jump right into it. Can you share with our audience a little bit about yourself, your family, and your experiences?
Sure. I work at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. My title is Program Coordinator for the IDD Toolkit, which is an online resource for medical and healthcare professionals to better serve adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there is a section on mental and behavioral health. So if you're interested in checking that out, it's www.iddtoolkit.org. And I also blog for another project at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, and that's Tennessee Works, which is about employment of people with disabilities and trying to improve the employment landscape for those with disabilities in our state. And I generally write from a sort of a parent or family perspective. So things that I'm interested in, that I learn about, that I think individuals with disabilities and their families might be interested in, I either write about it myself or I ask the person who's created the program or who's the executive director or whatever to write about it. And we have 6 years worth of archives, so people can go back, and it's tennesseeworks.org, Rise to Work blog. Um, the other important thing to know is that I'm the parent of a now 27-year-old on the autism spectrum, and Evan does not have much communication, and he has some significant behavior issues, and he's also been diagnosed with several mental health conditions. So I come at this from several different directions.
Thank you so much for being here and for taking your time. And I want to let everyone know that in the comment, or not the comment section, the description section, there is a long list of links that were provided by Janet, everything that you could possibly need. So as she references these throughout the thing, you're thinking, I can't write that down. I can't write that fast enough. What did you say? Everything that she references and more is in that resource section in the description. So thank you, Janet, sincerely for compiling that for us, giving folks resources that they can use after we're done talking and this is over is absolutely incredible. We certainly appreciate that.
Well, I'm all about sharing resources and networking. And one thing guess I should say is, for those of you who don't know what the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center is, it is a university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. In addition to what we call the USED, we also have an intellectual and developmental disabilities research center at the Kennedy Center. We have a LIND program, which is Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, where we train pre-professionals such as folks training to be doctors, training to be audiologists, training to be special education teachers, who do special work to try to create leaders in the neurodevelopmental disabilities field. And then we have TRIAD, which is the Treatment and Research Institute for Autism Disorders. All of that is, we have what we call the 4 pillars at the Kennedy Center, and I work for one of those pillars, the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities.
That is very, very awesome. Have you been there? I know it's a weird question, but have you been there a long time? Is this
I'll try to be brief. No, I spent almost 30 years as a copy editor for the Tennessean in Nashville,
Oh, wow.
and in 2009 I was laid off, and I had been a member of the Kennedy Center's Community Advisory Council, and the director at that time of the Kennedy Center got a grant to do stress intervention with parents of kids with disabilities. And as she was announcing this grant, I'm sitting in the audience going, "Ooh, ooh, hire me," because I'm an out of work parent of a kid with a disability. And she said, "Well, Janet, we've actually thought about you." And I thought, "Well, she's just being nice, but good, yay, rah." And so I got hired in January of 2010 to be a parent mentor in a stress intervention project for parents of kids with disabilities. We had two different arms. One was based on mindfulness, and one was based on positive psychology. And I did this series on positive psychology and absolutely loved it. And when that grant ended, I then got the IDD Toolkit grant and been working with that grant, worked with the Tennessee Works grant, did a project called Putting Faith to Work, in which we worked with faith communities to help people with disabilities get jobs through the networking ability of their congregations and faith communities. Um, so I've been doing this now going on 13 years. So, and I love it. I get to do stuff all the time that I really enjoy doing because talking with families, talking with individuals with disabilities, networking, sharing resources, trying to help people get better supports and services. I did that for many years as a volunteer. Now I get to get paid for it.
Mhm. That's wonderful, Janet. We are so there's nothing better than that alignment of your passion and being able to eat, right? I know that's a funny way to say, but I remember being a volunteer, and I always thought I wish I had more time. I wish I had more time, and of course the way to get that is to turn pro. So I'm glad that you turned pro, Janet. We're super happy to have you. So another question that we all have is, what are some key things to know about autism? Since we're talking about autism, IDD, and mental health, what are some key things to know? You mentioned a language, I want to say barrier, but I'm probably using the wrong words, which I think many people believe is a key diagnostic criteria of autism. But while it may be common, it's not 100%. Can you sort of dissect that for our audience a little?
Well, if you really want to dive into it deeply, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 has the clinical qualifications or eligibility. And I won't go into those deeply, but there have to be persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. And that that has to manifest itself early. So like if somebody develops this at 43, that's not autism is not going to be the diagnosis.
Okay.
But like for my son, he had language as an or as a toddler and he lost it. And for someone like him, getting an autism diagnosis early on is fairly easy if you can get in to see a diagnostician. But for many people who are communicative, and who have higher IQs, getting an autism diagnosis can be very difficult. But there has to be those persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. But then there also has to be restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And that can be motor movements that are repetitive. One of the things that many families see in their young children who end up with a diagnosis of autism is they don't play with their toys, they line them up. And if you line them up, if the child lines them up and you mess up their line, that can create a huge meltdown, or what you would typically call a tantrum. But I hesitate to use the word tantrum because it really isn't a manipulative way to get what they want. It's generally something in the environment is causing them distress and they don't know how to explain it. Or they may not have the language to explain it. They may not be able in that moment to explain it. Um, and there's an insistence on sameness or routines or ritualized patterns. There may be fixated interests. So if somebody corners you at a cocktail party and tells you all about train schedules for 30 or 40 minutes, you've probably got somebody on the spectrum. It's just, um, it's that abnormal intensity, and they may have an unusual response to sensory input. They may be hyposensitive. In other words, you know, things that might bother you, heat or bright lights or whatever, may not bother you, but it may bother them. Or it can be just the opposite. Things that you think would be cause for concern, they don't seem to feel or notice. Um, and as I said, it has to be present early on. It may not be diagnosed till later. And then it has to be cause a significant impairment in either social, occupational, or other important area of functioning. And since my son was diagnosed in 1998 at the age of 2, um, they have added what are called levels of severity. There weren't those levels when he was diagnosed. And the severity level is based on level 1 just means you require some support to be able to do things, either, keep your house or manage your finances or get a job or whatever. Level 2 requires substantial support, so more than a few hours a week. And then level 3 requires substantial, very substantial support. So my son he would be considered a level 3. He requires 24-hour supports and services. He lives in a Medicaid waiver supported situation. He is by himself because of behavior issues, but he has staff through our state's what are called the 1915C waivers. Um, and they cook for him, they pay his bills, they, take him out to do stuff that he wants to do and all that. So that's kind of a broad overview of autism. I do know folks who've gotten autistic diagnoses as adults, either because their children were diagnosed and they heard the doctor explain all the symptoms, and then they're sitting there thinking, wow, that kind of sounds like me. And then they seek out an evaluation. Or they may just have, some questions or quandaries about why are things so difficult for me that other people find so easy? And these are people, as I said, who are generally pretty communicative. They may have gone to college, may have gotten degrees, may be married and have a family, but still feel like there's something different about me. And honestly, finding a diagnosis as an adult can be pretty challenging.
I can certainly see that. The it's a weird segue, but my next question is how do autism and mental health conditions intersect? Is their diagnostic overshadowing, or are they completely separate?
Well, uh, first of all, I'm going to cite some statistics that I gathered in preparation for this talk today because I don't carry these stats in my head. But
I appreciate that.
recent research has found that 85% of children with autism also have some form of co-occurring psychiatric diagnosis, and at least 35% are taking at least one psychotropic medication. Um, and individuals, and includes adults with autism spectrum disorders, have a high prevalence of multiple mental health conditions. Among those with ASD, 50 to 70% have ADHD, and my son has a diagnosis of ADHD. 26% of the population has a diagnosis of depression, and that's 26 versus about 10% of the general population. About 30% of the autistic population has anxiety versus about 10% of the general population. Bipolar disorder, 11% of people on the autism spectrum have a bipolar disorder diagnosis. And 7% of the autistic population has a diagnosis of schizophrenia versus 0.5% of the general population. So ADHD, anxiety, and depression are among the most diagnosed co-occurring disorders. And one thing I do want to mention, suicide is a key issue for autistic adults, particularly those who don't have an intellectual disability and who are more communicative and more aware of their own differences from the typical population. And for many, many years, I'd heard the term diagnostic overshadowing, meaning that people with autism really didn't often get diagnosed with other things because everything was attributed to their autism. They didn't want to participate in things because they were autistic. Well,
Okay.
actually, no, they were depressed or they were afraid to go out in public. Well, it was because of their autism. Well, no, it's because their anxiety was so overwhelming, they couldn't deal with it. But I've recently come to understand that diagnostic overshadowing from the mental health perspective may often overshadow the possibility of an autism diagnosis for those who are more communicative, who are more educated, who have for years been able to compensate on their own. And so they're often given a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or ADHD. And then when they really find that none of the medications and therapies for that are working, they think, maybe I have autism too. And oftentimes mental health providers who are dealing with these adults are reluctant to say, well, yes, you do, because they don't really have a good skill set for diagnosing autism. There are really limited numbers of people who do a good job of diagnosing autism in adults.
It really sounds like you've sort of covered this a little bit in pointing out that people want to attach everything to autism. You mentioned if you don't want to go outside, it's because of autism. If you don't want to, hang out with your friends, it's autism instead of anxiety and depression. But are those, so I imagine that those are, of course, key barriers for individuals on the spectrum getting appropriate mental health care. Are there others?
Are there other conditions?
I'm sorry, are there other barriers to people on the spectrum getting good quality getting appropriate mental health care?
Yeah, certainly, because first of all, many mental health providers, as well as physical health providers, have very little training in working with people with autism or intellectual disabilities. So, when my son presents, he doesn't have language. So, like when we were seeking care for him with a mental health provider, oh, well, he doesn't communicate. Well, then we don't deal with him, period. There was no, you know, because there was no group therapy, there was no talk therapy, because he can't tell you how he's feeling or thinking. Um, and so, there are ways to do therapy with folks like my son, but it's more like play therapy and interacting and kind of seeing how they respond. But those kinds of providers are few and far between. And even if you've got somebody who's more communicative, still understanding that many healthcare mental health providers, as well as physical health providers, have a bias against people with disabilities. Now, you may say, well, they're dealing with people with mental health conditions. Those are disabilities, but that's a little different. And I think I shared as a possible resource. I worked with a group called the Center for Dignity for People with Disabilities in Healthcare, and they created how to find a non-ableist therapist, a little toolkit or worksheet to help you walk through if you're a person with a disability trying to find an appropriate mental health provider. Um, they Mental health providers often don't have experience working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism. There's very
Wow.
little training. Um, and a lack of a willingness, because it may take longer to get to the point where the person trusts you and feels like you have their best interest at heart. So it may be more time consuming to treat a person on the autism spectrum or with an intellectual and developmental disability. And then the other huge issue is financial. Many of our folks, when I say our folks, I'm generally talking about folks more like my son and not the folks who have a degree in astrophysics. Uh,
Certainly, certainly.
Many of our folks rely on Medicaid or TennCare. And there are very few mental health providers who are highly trained in this area who are willing to take Medicaid. Many of them don't take any kind of insurance at all. And you're looking at probably anywhere from 150 to $250 an hour out of pocket for folks. And
Wow.
for many individuals, particularly those relying on SSI or SSDI, that's just out of the realm of possibility.
Wow. You've touched on some of this already, but I want to bring up the question again because I know that there's so much more. Why is it important to have a mental health provider who understands autism or developmental disabilities? Aside from the obvious, sometimes I want to say, Janet, first, thank you for answering these questions. And
Sure.
but, as an advocate and as somebody who's been doing this a long time, I think isn't it obvious? Like, what do you mean? Why is it important to have a mental health provider who understands somebody's condition, somebody's life, somebody's issues, somebody's just what do you mean? Why is that important? Is that really a question that we need to answer? But yes, it is a question that we need to answer. And I'm so glad that you're here and able to help people understand.
Well, I almost hesitate to bring this up, but I think it kind of highlights the issue. Um, there was a survey done 2 years ago. Now, this included primarily physical health providers, not mental health providers, but many physicians felt like people with disabilities had a lower quality of life. And this became really clear during COVID-19 because they were actually creating criteria to to choose who would get care first. And people with disabilities were actually put lower on the list. And there were some states that even suggested taking ventilators away from people with disabilities who relied on them all the time in order to use them with normal people with COVID. Um, so this was a huge issue, uh, that there's just sort of an inbred bias that if you have a disability, your life has less quality. You can't possibly be, you know, you don't. I don't know how to say this gently, but your life is not as valuable as a typical person's, because you live in a wheelchair or you have autism or you have an intellectual disability, and you may not be able to contribute the same way, or you may not live as long. If we treat you and you only live 3 years because you have a disability, and we treat this other person then they live 26 more years, you know have we used our resources wisely? And so there's this inherent bias in many healthcare providers, that I don't know that it's intentional, but that's oftentimes because they have little experience with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because it's those folks who have family members, who have siblings, who have aunts or uncles, who really go into this work with a passion to serve our folks. Um, and I would equate it to oftentimes the implicit bias that white people can have against other races. You may not feel like you're racist, but there may be things that underlie the way you act or the way you talk, and it's almost sort of like a cultural competency. And and getting to know people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism, just changes your perspectives if you've never had any experience with people who are different from you.
Thank you so much, Janet, for touching on all of that. They're really big concepts and it can get messy really quickly. And I know that a lot of people, they're like, well, that sounds very complicated and that sounds very messy. So I'm out. And I just, and listen, as a lazy person, as a person who spends so much time on the couch, I'm not saying that I don't, I'm just saying that these are humans, right? These are people, these are our friends, neighbors, family members, colleagues. I mean, just it's really super important. And well, I live with bipolar disorder, and I would never wish bipolar disorder on anyone. But I didn't know that I had bipolar. I was diagnosed at 26 because I flew under the radar because everybody just thought that it was a behavioral issue or hormones, or my parents didn't know. But could you imagine if my family would have just decided to make all of these decisions based on their ignorance about how we're going to treat people with disabilities and mental illness, et cetera? Then their son shows up and it's like, hey, that thing that you didn't have time to understand, you helped pass a series of laws that are now going to harm your son. And I think I explain it that way because that's the real reality. Nobody, oftentimes we as the collective don't want to pay attention to something until it gets to us or somebody we care about. But the problem is that the best time to plant a tree is 25 years ago. And if you didn't take the opportunity 25 years ago, you're not going to get that shade, and it's going to be so much harder. I know that it's messy, and I appreciate that it's messy, but we have to come together and help. I thank you again. Let's talk about specific resources. I'm a little bit afraid to ask this question because where can an individual or family look for resources? And you've just explained that the resources are just super problematic, but I know that there are resources out there, and I know we want to take some time to cover them.
Well, first of all, let me say I appreciate your honesty and openness. My mother was diagnosed as bipolar. Well, actually, it was manic depression because she was diagnosed in 1971. I was 11 years old, and bless her heart, I don't know about you, but she's the only person I ever encountered who stayed on her medication faithfully from the time she was diagnosed till the time she died at 92 in 2019.
I have broken, at least for me, the curse of not going off of my medication. But I always give a shout out. It's not because of me. It's because all of the people around me were like, look, we've talked to a whole bunch of people who have done this, so don't. And they worked really hard with peer support and family education, and everybody was like, hey, we see you're getting better. Any thoughts of going off that medication? And I was about to say, I feel like I want to. And they're like, okay, you're allowed to say that. Let's talk this out. So I want to give
Well,
full credit
good,
to the
good.
people around me. If I would have been left to my own devices after a couple of years, I would have been like, hey, things are going well. Done.
Well, good for
Where are the
you.
resources hiding?
My my mother, bless her heart, had great faith in her psychiatrist, and she always did. Now, she didn't ever meet a pill she didn't like, but she never took more than she was supposed to. Whatever the doctor said, that's what she did. And
Very cool.
and it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns, but the fact that she lived to be 92 tells you a lot
Yeah.
about her ability to function and continue to have a life. She was married and had 2 kids, including me, and I think she did a fairly good job. Uh,
You did a great job.
anyway, so where can a family or individual look for resources? My first suggestion is actually something that's connected to the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, and that's called Tennessee Disability Pathfinder. And that's a resource that's linked. They have a database of I think about 6,000 resources, and it's got all kinds of things. There's mental health resources, there's resources about employment. You can either call and talk to the folks, and the folks who staff the lines there are either parents of kids with disabilities, and I say kids, adults as well as children, or they're a person with a disability themselves. And so you can call and talk to them and tell them what you're looking for, or you can do a search. Go to the site, and it allows you to walk through what you want, who you're wanting to serve, whether they've got insurance or not. It's very, very useful. For autism specific mental health resources, I generally suggest people go to Autism Tennessee. Now, you will either have to email them or call them to get their list of resources. They no longer list them on the website. I'm not sure exactly why, but they do provide a list, and these are people who have been suggested to Autism Tennessee as people who are either knowledgeable or willing to serve folks on the spectrum and do a good job. The Chattanooga Autism Center also has resources available. And there is within the Chattanooga Autism Center, there's the GCA Center for Adult Autism, and that the GCA is the Greater Chattanooga Aspies. I don't know if your folks listening know this, but when the DSM-5 came out, they did away with the separate diagnoses of Asperger's syndrome, autism spectrum, and what was called PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. And they put them all under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. So there is no longer a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. But ASPEs often prefer that categorization. And one thing I did not mention, there is a huge controversy among the autism community about what to call folks. Many of us who have had kids diagnosed years and years ago grew up about using people first language. So the people are first and then the disability. So people with autism, people with mental health disorders. As more folks have grown up and as more people, particularly with Asperger's syndrome, have gotten on social media, um, there's a greater desire because they feel it is such an integral part of who they are and how they function in the world that they prefer identity first language. So they will say, I'm an autistic person, or I'm autistic. And so you generally would do best to ask what a person prefers. I sort of go back and forth because I have my foot in kind of both worlds. The folks who still prefer the people first and folks who use identity first. And another issue in terms of language, which I didn't touch on, is the neurodiversity movement, which I don't know if that's a phrase that's familiar to you or the folks listening, but it is an effort to say that, we need to be embracing people who think in all kinds of different ways, whether it's ADHD or whether it's autism or whatever, because so much of the time it is a neurodiverse way of looking at the world. We have neurotypicals and neurodiverse, or neurodivergent. Um, and within that, I guess I'm running out of time, aren't I? I'll wrap this up.
We have
But
plenty of time. Keep talking.
um, but there's also been a controversy between those of us who have children or loved ones with really intense needs who don't really feel like autism is a superpower, which is kind of the language that many of the folks in the neurodivergent side of things seem to feel. And there are certainly superpowers. There are people who can really hone in on details, who can see big picture things that many of us can't see. Um, but so far, we haven't found my son's superpower. Um, and there's a concern that the emphasis on the neurodiversity may lead to fewer supports and services. That's not really what they're after because many of those folks need supports and services too, but there is that concern. Um, So going on with where families can look for resources or individuals, Vanderbilt has a Vanderbilt Autism Resource Line, and for children and teens, there are research studies they can participate in, and sometimes they can get a diagnosis that way if they're having trouble um, finding a diagnostician. And there are also treatments available through that research. Um, and then we talk about supports and services. There aren't really supports and services specifically for people with autism, but there are for intellectual and developmental disabilities. For children and teens who are not on TennCare currently, there's what's called the Katie Beckett waiver, but the individual has to be under 18, and that provides funding and support for families who make too much money to qualify for TennCare. For children and teens who are already on TennCare, there's something called EPSDT, which is, and I'll probably get this wrong, but it's early periodic screening, diagnostics, and treatment. And the idea is that medical folks should be screening TennCare children to see if they have a disability, including autism. And if they do, to provide the supports and services to ameliorate their disability. Um, and then for children and adults on TennCare, there is what's called Employment and Community First Choices Waiver Program. And this provides the kind of support like my son has. Although it's not as intense for children, it does allow families to get some help. And now is a great time to apply because the state just opened up 2,000 new slots, and they are saying that there is nobody going to be on the waiting list if you need services right now. They're
That's
not going
great.
to they're not going to put you on the waiting list if you say, "Well, I think my son or daughter may need services, in 10 years." They're just going to tell you apply in 10 years.
Oh,
But
gotcha.
right now, if you need services, they say to apply now. Um, for adults who are more communicative and interested in employment, Vanderbilt has the Frisk Center for Autism and Innovation, and they have lots and lots of resources there about finding a job, workplaces that are amenable to neurodivergent individuals, and just a great group of folks who work there. And then nationally, some groups that offer support and information. The Autistic Self Advocacy Network is a great place to check out, and the Asperger and Autism Network. Um, if you're really interested in mental health and intellectual developmental disabilities, there's what's called NAD, which used to be the National Association for the Dually Diagnosed. And in this case, dual diagnosis means intellectual disability and mental health, not substance abuse. So that's a great resource. And then there was a national training center that was created a couple of years ago. And this has particularly good information for what we call self advocates, so people on the autism spectrum themselves. And it's called the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center. And there are lots of videos and lots of information there about teaching self advocacy skills and mental health conditions that intersect with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then, as I mentioned, the IDD Toolkit has a section on mental and behavioral health. And one last thing, can I can I can I add one last thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things that has become clear to me, my son Evan has a twin, and he also has an older sister. Um, Both of them deal with anxiety and depression. But for many years, I felt like Evan's twin also dealt with PTSD. And he really didn't want to explore that until just recently. And we actually got together with a national sibling group and found that this is becoming a much greater issue. and people are willing to talk about it. For several years, my son Brendan did not want to post in the sibling Facebook group because he said everybody was, always talking about how wonderful their sibling was and what a great relationship they had, and just, how having a sibling with a disability was just so great and it just made them feel so wonderful. And he said, honestly, there were some really hard things growing up with my brother. Well, it turns out that there's also a Facebook group for younger folks in their 20s. And this is becoming a significant issue. The trauma involved in living with someone who has really aggressive and self-injurious behaviors. Um, Although I hate to say this, it really does almost constitute domestic violence. Um, because for many, the behavior can seem to come out of nowhere, and having to protect yourself from your sibling, or try to keep your sibling from hurting themselves, can be really, really daunting. Um, and there's a group called Tennessee Adult Brothers and Sisters, which that's for those who are now adults. My daughter Emma Shouse Garten actually runs the TABS group, and they do online meetings, so you don't have to go anywhere to be a part of TABS. You can, and she's opened it up to anybody in any state who wants to be a part of it. Um, but I think this is an issue that we need to consider, that we often didn't. Um, and it's really hard to talk about. It was hard for my son, but he, I think, has finally realized that, yeah, he probably does have PTSD as a result. Anything else?
Somehow my microphone got muted. I certainly apologize for that. I put I put all of the links in the comments, and of course all of the links are also in the description. There's quite a bit, but everything that she talked about is in there, and a few more. So please check that out. Lots of great resources, lots of great information. Bookmark it, come back to it, share it. Absolutely a wonderfully curated list. The tabs group that you just talked about, I've put it on the screen, and just now it's right there. And of course, I also put it in the comment section, and it's in the description. Lots of wonderful information to pass along to folks. Janet, I can't thank you enough. And I do want to, I don't want to co-sign what you said, because you said it very, very well. But sincerely, when I reached recovery and I learned what my family went through, what they were up against, what they were faced with, the supports that they lacked, I saw it from my perspective, right? It was all, and I went through a lot. I'm not trying to say that I did not, but of course, my mother has a son who is sick, and everybody's like, he should just get his, crap together. And in my mom's like, that's not what I need. I need a hug. I need support. I need a casserole. The number of people that did not give my mother a casserole, my mother is a very forgiving person, but I know who you are. You bring casseroles for everything, everything. And my mom didn't get a hug. But sincerely, I'm glad that you're speaking out about it, because we don't want to talk about it because we feel that it's mean, or we feel that we're blaming, or we feel that there's shame. But the reality is just because that's the way it has to be doesn't mean that it's not traumatizing or scary, or that people don't need supports through it. So thank you for sharing that people need supports. Thank you for helping people understand that. And of course, thank you for helping provide the support that people need. It's definitely super, super appreciated. Janet, do you have any final words before we, I'm going to say, head on out into the sunset?
Well, I just hope I didn't overwhelm folks, because I have a tendency to be kind of a fire hose in talking about supports and services and resources. And I hate the idea of overwhelming anybody, but I also know that there's lots of good information. And in many cases, there are supports and services available, but you've often got to hunt. And they're not always readily available, but I'm happy to talk about this kind of stuff and hope that it can be helpful to someone.
It will absolutely be helpful. Thank you once again, Janet, and thank you everybody else for being here. We will
Yes.
see you next time on NAMI Tennessee at Home Live.